Tomorrow marks 5 years since George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis by former police officer Derek Chauvin.
Today marks a somber day in Minneapolis and communities all across the United States and across the world. 5 years ago, George Floyd, 46-year-old black man, was murdered by Derek Chauvin, a 44-year-old white Minneapolis police officer.
There is one person that President Trump should pardon from federal charges forthwith. It would be incredibly controversial, but I think that it's absolutely necessary. That person is Derek Chauvin. President Trump should, in fact, pardon Derek Chauvin. He should. He should pardon him his federal charges.
All right, it's 5 years since the George Floyd incident. And now Ben Shapiro's saying that he should be pardoned by Trump federally. But I'm going to surprise you and tell you one thing. Ben Shapiro is lying to you. Again, I'm going to make sure I say it very clearly. Ben Shapiro is lying to you, and he's trying to confuse the situation. Let me explain. Okay, so today we're talking about George Floyd, Minnesota. I thought we were done with this, but it keeps rearing its ugly head time and time again. Now, for those of you who don't remember, we watched the entire trial and saw Derek Chauvin being convicted. Now, it's been 5 years since that happened, and Ben Shapiro has come out with a couple of videos claiming that President Trump should pardon Derek Chauvin for his federal crimes. Now, there's been a lot of you who've asked me to look into Ben Shapiro's reasoning about why Derek Chauvin should get a presidential pardon and see if I agree with it. And I'm going to tell you, not only do I not agree with it, I think Ben Shapiro is honestly trying to con his audience. I think he's playing all of the people who believe he's asking for a presidential pardon for Derek Chauvin. He's playing you for a fool. Now, I know that's a crazy statement, but let me explain to you how I've come to that conclusion. But first, I have to educate you on what happened with Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin was prosecuted in two separate jurisdictions. First, the state of Minnesota, where he was found guilty of the second-degree unintentional murder of George Floyd. As it says here in the amended complaint, second-degree murder unintentional while committing a felony. Now, that underlying felony was assault. And that's because Minnesota, if you assault someone and that assault leads to them dying, then you can be charged with what's known as felony murder because you were committing the felony of assault. That assault led to the person's death. Then you have felony murder, which can get you up to 40 years in prison. And since this is an unintentional, as it says here, unintentional second-degree murder, you don't have to prove that Chauvin actually intended to commit the murder. You just have to prove that he intended to commit the underlying felony, which was assault. And I think you can make an easy argument that he committed an assault against George Floyd. And in the commission of that assault, George Floyd died. There you have felony murder, which he was convicted of. Now, in the case in the state of Minnesota, there was a jury. We watched the trial. All that occurred. Derek Chauvin didn't plead guilty to anything in the Minnesota case. Now, let's move to the federal case. Now, in the federal case, Derek Chauvin pled guilty. There was no jury. There was no trial. He pled guilty. Now, Derek Chauvin pled guilty to willfully depriving two citizens of their constitutional rights, specifically the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizures and the right to be free from unreasonable force by police officers. Now, again, Derek Chauvin admitted to depriving two citizens of their rights that led to these charges. One was a juvenile, and that event occurred on September 4th, 2017. And the second was the George Floyd incident that occurred on March 25th, 2020. Now, this is what Derek Chauvin is on record to admitting to. The defendant admits that his willful use of unreasonable force resulted in Mr. Floyd's bodily injury and death because his actions impaired Mr. Floyd's ability to obtain and maintain sufficient oxygen to sustain Mr. Floyd's life. And when it comes to the juvenile, the defendant admits, he admitted to this, to using unreasonable force was so willful as evidenced by the report the defendant wrote about the incident in which he omitted that he repeatedly struck the juvenile in the head with a flashlight, grabbed juvenile by the throat, and used his knee to pin juvenile to the ground for more than 15 minutes. The defendant's willful uses of unreasonable force resulted in the bodily injury to juvenile 1. And here is Derek Chauvin's signature on this plea agreement to denote that, yes, he signed this under penalty of perjury, that everything he's saying in this document is true. And his attorney also signed it. So let's just put it all together. Minnesota, you had a jury trial, unintentional murder, all that stuff about fentanyl and all that stuff applies in that particular case. And in that case, a jury found him guilty of the second-degree murder that was unintentional. Then you have the federal case, which is totally different. It's not about George Floyd being killed, but that Derek Chauvin admitted to depriving both Floyd and an unnamed juvenile of their constitutional rights. There was no trial and there was no jury. So now we have the two separate cases, the murder case in Minnesota and the deprivation of rights in the federal circuit. Now, when it comes to what Trump can do, he can pardon Chauvin for the federal deprivation of rights. Now, in that particular case, remember, Chauvin has said, I did this. I deprived this juvenile, who was like 12 or 14, of his rights when I bashed him over the head with the flashlight and arrested him unjustly, right? That's one of the federal charges. And then the second charge is Derek Chauvin admitted to using excessive force against George Floyd, and that was also a deprivation of rights. So now let's listen to Ben Shapiro explain what exactly he's going after here.
But when it came to BLM, the inciting event for the BLM riots that caused $2 billion in property damage in the United States and set America's race relations on their worst footing in my lifetime, was in fact the railroading of Derek Chauvin in the death of George Floyd. The evidence demonstrates that Derek Chauvin did not, in fact, commit murder of George Floyd. George Floyd was high on. He had a significant pre-existing heart condition.
Now, I'm stopping this right here because Ben Shapiro is being incredibly, and I'm going to say it, incredibly dishonest with the law here. Now, if this was just some novice who wasn't an attorney, I would give them a lot of slack. I would be like, well, this may be a concept they don't understand. But Ben Shapiro, he's a lawyer, and I know for a fact he understands it. It's known as the eggshell plaintiff or eggshell victim rule. The principle here is you find the victim as they are. Here is an example that happens all the time in the law. Someone goes and robs a bank or even a store, and the clerk behind the counter has a pre-existing heart condition. So when the robber pulls out the gun, the person then has a heart attack. Well, in that particular case, that robber would be charged with the murder of that person who had the heart condition because you take the victim as they are. And this also happens a lot with elderly people, where if you push down on someone who's 90 years old, they could die from that fall, where if someone who is, let's say, 50 or even in their 20s wouldn't. Now, that was a long way to say, in law, it doesn't matter what your pre-existing condition is. If someone exacerbates that condition that leads to your death in the commission of a crime, then you're going to be held accountable under the murder statute. Ben Shapiro knows this, every lawyer knows this, and again, I think he's lying to the audience because he hopes the audience is just so ignorant to this concept that he can say these things and it gets around everyone's head.
He was even out of the car. He was in the car saying he could not breathe. Derek Chauvin, for large segments of even the tape that was shown, had his knee on George Floyd's shoulder or back, not on his neck. The autopsy of George Floyd showed that he had no damage to his trachea, that probably George Floyd died of excited delirium. There were no accusations, even at trial, that Derek Chauvin had committed a hate crime against George Floyd or that he targeted George Floyd because of his race. Nonetheless, on the basis of extraordinarily scanty evidence, and despite the fact that there was massive pressure on the jury.
No, I have to stop it right here again. He's asking for President Trump to pardon Derek Chauvin on his federal charges. There was no jury, as we discussed before. All this evidence he's talking about wasn't presented in that case. Derek Chauvin pled guilty to those charges, admitted to the underlying conduct, and also said he did it previously to a juvenile where he beat the kid over the head with the flashlight. So I don't know what Ben's talking about when he says the jury was confused. The jury was this. In Derek Chauvin's federal trial, which he's asking that Trump pardon him for the federal charges, there was no jury. There was no trial. This is why I'm saying he's actively lying to you.
That the mayor of Minneapolis paid a settlement to the George Floyd family immediately. That the president of the United States suggested that Derek Chauvin was guilty right off the bat. That the jurors were being openly threatened and admitted as much, despite the fact that there was massive pressure on the jury. That the mayor of Minneapolis paid a settlement to the George Floyd family immediately. That the president of the United States suggested that Derek Chauvin was guilty right off the bat. That the jurors were being openly threatened and admitted as much. Despite all of that, Derek Chauvin was convicted on federal charges and pled guilty to federal charges.
Now, do you see how deceptive that was? Do you see how he's playing you for a fool? There was no jury in the federal case. He wasn't convicted by a jury in the federal case. That's the state case he's talking about. In the federal case, he said, yes, I beat that 14-year-old with a flashlight, depriving him of his constitutional rights because I was a police officer. So he's asking President Trump to pardon him for that? That's before George Floyd. And Ben Shapiro needs to read this plea agreement because Derek Chauvin actually admitted to depriving George Floyd of his rights because he used excessive force. Now, I want to be clear. Everything Ben Shapiro's talking about happened in the state trial. Trump can't pardon him for the state charges. He can only pardon him for the federal charges. And Ben Shapiro is lying to you. And the way he's lying to you is he's making an argument against the state charges, but then tries to hide the fact that he really wants Derek Chauvin to be pardoned for bashing a 14-year-old in the head with a flashlight. That's what he's actually asking Trump to do. Now, I want you to listen to this last part again, where he has to concede that Derek Chauvin pled guilty to federal charges, but he's going to make it almost sound like a jury found Derek Chauvin guilty of those federal charges. Listen to the way he sets it up again.
That the jurors were being openly threatened and admitted as much. Despite all of that, Derek Chauvin was convicted on federal charges and pled guilty to federal charges.
Yeah, he's trying to scam you, people. Ben Shapiro is trying to scam the audience. And I don't say that lightly, but he's literally trying to scam you.
And it led to vast chaos. It led to, again, the destruction of racial comedy in the United States, $2 billion in property damage, and a guy rotting in prison who the evidence demonstrates certainly was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in that case. If we're going to talk about delivering pardons, President Trump, I think, should really seriously consider pardoning on federal charges. He can't pardon on state charges Derek Chauvin, who is convicted of the murder of George Floyd.
Now, I want to be very clear when I say this. Ben Shapiro is actively lying to you. He's being extremely dishonest and disingenuous. Derek Chauvin was not convicted of killing George Floyd for federal charges. He just wasn't. Matter of fact, he pled guilty. He said, I did it. This is the way I did it. The evidence shows it. And then on top of that, he also said, I've done it before in 2017 to a 14-year-old. I think the kid was like 14 years old, maybe it was between 12 and 14, where he bashed him over the head, put handcuffs on him, put his knee on his back and stood over him for 12 minutes. He's got a pattern of doing this. So for Ben Shapiro to pretend that the federal charges were based on the death of George Floyd alone is a lie. And on top of that, Derek Chauvin has other federal charges like tax evasion that obviously he's not bringing up. So Ben has just essentially just told everybody, hey, the jury got it wrong. They were coerced. They were threatened. But when you just look at the documents, people, don't trust me. There was no jury in the federal trial. He says there was no proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Yes, there was. He said, I did exactly what they're saying I did. That's your proof beyond a reasonable doubt. When the defendant says, I did it, that's your proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He said he did it twice. I don't understand. Now, if he was asking for donations to pardon Chauvin on the state charges, trying to get the governor of the state, then I think he'd have a better argument. But as of right now, his argument to ask Trump to pardon Chauvin on those federal charges, which had more to do with depriving citizens of their constitutional rights as a law enforcement officer, the 14-year-old. So Ben Shapiro is trying to grift you. He's trying to lie to you, but this is not any type of legal analysis. And everything that he's saying about the Chauvin trial, even if I agree with the stuff he's saying with Minnesota, which I don't, but even if I did agree, it would be irrelevant to the federal charges. Tell me when I'm wrong in the comment section. Tell me, hey, Nate, I agree with Ben Shapiro. He's the best, because I don't really say this a lot, especially about other attorneys. But he's just straight up lying to you, gaslighting you, and trying to get you to believe something that's obviously not true. Because he's hoping you are not sophisticated enough to look at the documents, to hear the arguments, and to understand what he's doing is just extremely dishonest. I have a lot of problems with the George Floyd incident. I have a lot of problems with BLM. But I'm not going to sit here and lie to you to make you think something is not the case when it is. Obviously, the George Floyd thing, I personally don't think it had anything to do with race. I just think it happened to be a road cop doing something ridiculous at a bad time. And unfortunately, it happens every day. If George Floyd could have been white, and I think the same thing would have happened if he acted the same way. So with that being said, don't forget to like, subscribe, to look at YouTube stuff. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section, because I honestly, when you guys started sending me this, I was like, oh, okay, this may be interesting. I'm always up to hearing, a point of view that may challenge a longly held belief. But what he's just doing here is just he's hoping the audience is so dumb that they won't be able to decipher his quick speak and nonsense. And don't forget, like, subscribe, to look at YouTube stuff. My name is Nate the Lawyer, and I'm out. Peace.